Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today, Father Uwe Michael Lang, is a priest of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in London. He's a senior lecturer in liturgy and church history at St. Mary's University in Twickenham in London. And also, among other things, he's a board member of the Society for Catholic Liturgy and editor of Antiphon, a journal for liturgical renewal. He's written and edited many books on the liturgy, most recently, A Short History of the Roman Mass, published by Ignatius Press, which we will discuss today. Father Michael, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation, Thomas.
I know that this book is in part a briefer introduction to the history of the Roman Mass, distilled from a longer work that you've written. But is there a particular thesis that you had in mind, or any particular points that you were central to your plan of writing this book?
Well, the intention for my longer study, my monograph, which was published in 2022, was really to look at the stable part of the Mass, the order of the Mass, and trace its origins, development through the centuries, and really to show the essential continuity in the order of the Mass. There are quite a lot of excellent studies on the history of the liturgy, on, say, perhaps more peripheral aspects, the development of the calendar, saints' feasts, particular rites, but I wanted to look at the core of the rite and really try to show its essential continuity in the Roman tradition over many centuries of religious, social, cultural, political, economic change.
How old is the Roman Rite?
Well, as far as we can look at written evidence, really, we have important texts from the 4th century. So when we see the Canon of the Mass developing, certainly, because the Mass in Rome is older, was celebrated from beginnings of Christian communities there. We have another sort of window into that early history in St. Justin Martyr's description of the Sunday Eucharist in Rome in the middle of the 2nd century. That's a very basic description. It gives us the structure, the outline of the Mass, and that's a very precious testimony. But it doesn't tell us a lot about the specific nature of the celebration. So the Roman Rite really, as a particular liturgical tradition, emerges for us with greater clarity from the 4th century onwards.
Is there a way to sum up what makes the Roman Rite distinctive from other rites?
Well, by comparison with Eastern liturgical traditions, the Byzantine Rite, for instance, there certainly is a greater sobriety and a kind of linear structure in the Roman Rite. Now, I have to qualify that term sobriety immediately. It is not sort of sober and simple by comparison with the many de-ritualized forms of Christianity we have today in the modern world, but by comparison with some of the very elaborate rites of Eastern Christianity, where you have the element of repetition and kind of circular structures much more prominent than in the Western tradition. So, the Romans had this sense of sort of linearity, structure, order, and that also somehow translated into the Roman liturgy. But again, by comparison with historical Christian rites, not with sort of, other forms of Christian liturgy today.
I see. So in the beginning of the book, you make this contrast between the view of Erasmus and the view of St. John Henry Newman, having to do with this topic of what I believe Pope Pius XII would have called antiquarianism, this idea that we can look back to the earliest stages of the development of the church and try to kind of recover a pure version of Christianity, whether that be in doctrine or in this case in the construction of liturgy. So what's the significance of that discussion? Of course, they lived 500 years apart, so they weren't in conversation with each other exactly. But why did you bring that up so early in the book?
I found it quite interesting to put them into a conversation, as it were. Erasmus was part of the Renaissance humanist movement that wanted to go to the sources of the Christian faith. So the biblical and patristic sources. He was very critical of scholastic theology, and he had the idea that if you only went back to the sources, you would find a sort of purer, simpler, clearer expression of Christian faith and practice. Now, Newman, who was a great historian of early Christianity, writes in the 19th century that, in fact, a stream, a river, is actually not clearest at the sources, where everything can be, a bit muddled up, a bit, but only when the river has already passed some way, and the riverbed is sort of broader and the stream is calmer, and perhaps the water is clearer. So, and I think that is actually a more accurate description of what we find when we study early Christianity. We have few sources. They only shed some spotlights on what happened, both in terms of doctrinal development and practice of worship. We would like to know much more, but we don't. So we have to be quite careful in making too bold assessments. And scholars tend to build very elaborate hypotheses on, often very little evidence. But
Right.
I think a certain humility is called for here, that we, often don't know as much as we would like to. And so the sources actually begin to flow in a much richer and broader way. So again, from the 4th century onwards.
And an example of that would be the second Eucharistic prayer in the current liturgy, which was supposed to be based on Saint Hippolytus of Rome in the apostolic tradition, which now, as I understand it, I believe is not even considered to be a representative Roman liturgy, even though it is a liturgy that was celebrated in Rome at the time. It was not anything like the typical Roman liturgy, because it was celebrated perhaps by a community of people who were from further east, but living in Rome. It was one of many different various forms at the time. So it's not like we can now recover based on the apostolic tradition what the Roman Rite would have originally been like.
Yes, that's right. At the time of Vatican II, scholars truly were convinced that here they had a document of the Roman liturgy from the early 3rd century and possibly even earlier, composed, not sort of written or put together, compiled by Saint Hippolytus of Rome, who at some point set himself up as an antipope, but then was reconciled and died a martyr, was venerated as a saint. But that whole construction has been largely undermined by more recent scholarship, and scholars now tend to argue that the document that we know as apostolic tradition, which actually in the sources never gets this title, is not from the 3rd century. It is actually a kind of living document. Liturgical documents are not like, say, the works of one theological author who writes a particular treatise, or St. Augustine's Confessions. He writes down his confessions, and that's the work, and we try to establish the most reliable, authentic text. But liturgical documents are different. They are used, and they are kept in use, and then they are changed. Things are added, things are perhaps removed. You can imagine someone crossing out something in an actual manuscript. They are perhaps combined with some other rites. So they are living documents, and it is quite possible that the so-called apostolic tradition contains early 3rd century material, but mostly it's maybe from the early 4th century, and we cannot sort of surgically extract what may be from the early 3rd century. And it's probably from the Christian East, because it left hardly any trace in the Western liturgical tradition, but it left many traces in the Eastern liturgical tradition, where you have many other sort of church orders, and that's what the document is. A document sort of regulating the life and worship and practice of a particular local church. So we have many church orders from the Christian East that are based and then develop the the apostolic tradition. So it's certainly not Roman, and why there is a Latin version of it from, I think, the 6th century is a bit of a mystery. As I say, there might have been some communities still using it, perhaps of Eastern origins. So it's certainly not an early witness to the Roman tradition. But again, the idea was here we have in the 60s, here we have an even earlier witness to the Roman tradition than the Roman canon. But actually, the first Eucharistic prayer coming from Rome, which we have in written form, is the Roman canon.
So this example of St. Hippolytus and the second Eucharistic prayer, one of the lessons could be that, we shouldn't make big changes based on, the scholarly consensus of the moment. But I think the more fundamental issue is that even if those scholars had been right, the principle of antiquarianism, it was arguably at play. And this is, I mentioned that, St. Pius XII talked about this, but he also condemned this as a method of liturgical development, the idea that certain customs should be revived simply because they are found in the earliest times. And on that point, it's also worth mentioning that the word tradition can be misunderstood as well, because tradition does not simply mean something that's old. It means something that has been constantly done. There are many, many customs of the early church, some universal and some not universal, which were dropped after a couple of centuries, like the agape meal or the refrigerium, where people would go eat meals at the tombs of the dead and things like that. And so simply because it was done at one time does not make it a tradition that then has to be revived. But it would seem that much of what happened in the post-Vatican II liturgical reform was based on this antiquarian philosophy, or at least certain practices were justified, even if not motivated, by the desire to return to the sources.
I would agree with that. There was this idea that going back to the sources means recovering some sort of earlier tradition which had really fallen out of use in some cases for a very long time. Now, there certainly is a sense in which we want to go back to the early church, to the apostolic period. Throughout the history of the church, there were important movements that, in fact, led to a revival, a true renewal of Christian life and practice by appeal to sort of an apostolic life. In fact, in the 11th, 12th century, there was a very strong movement calling itself the apostolic life, the Vita Apostolica, going back and somewhere imitating the Church of the Apostles in Jerusalem. Or, in fact, I'm an Oratorian of St. Philip Neri, and the early Oratorians thought that the kind of spiritual exercises St. Philip Neri instituted, we call that the oratory, sort of discourses, music, prayer, of course, some form of recreation, was kind of return to the apostolic practice of but at the same time, you can't simply jump over and ignore everything that lies in between. You can't simply connect to some early practice, as worthy and good as it may have been, and ignore everything that's been developed in between. You have to be very careful. Now, I think certainly if you use the organic analogy, which Pope Benedict XVI also used, organic development, so the liturgy is like a tree or a plant. You have to prune it occasionally. Perhaps you have to trim some of the branches so that it can grow better and it remains healthy. Yes, but you cannot simply cut it off and sort of create it from new.
So we've been talking about the Eucharistic prayer, and you mentioned the first complete Eucharistic prayer we have being the Roman Canon. Is that what you said, or am I misstating?
Not complete. So St. Ambrose of Milan quotes large parts of it in the late 4th century, but then the Gregorian canon of around the year 600 is fuller.
What should we know then about the development of the Roman Canon and its continuing significance for the Roman Rite?
Now, the Roman Canon appears, well, not quite out of nothing, but we don't really have precedence. I mean, we can't really reconstruct how it developed before some of the core prayers, sort of before and after the words of institution, are attested by Ambrose from Milan around the year 390.
And I'm sorry, I should mention for the listeners who don't know, the Roman Canon today, also known as Eucharistic Prayer 1, just so they know that what I'm talking about. Sorry, go on.
That's Eucharistic Prayer. So it is attested to by St. Ambrose in a form that is slightly different than the later canon. So the wording is different. You can see there's a bit of development. Some phrases are polished, some words are exchanged by others, but you can see it's basically the same Eucharistic prayer. That difference in wording reflects a period when there was some improvisation also in the use of Eucharistic prayer. So they weren't written down. I mean, there were patterns, there were sort of elements of contents of style that would be followed, but there was a certain freedom in actually praying. So not every word was fixed. And then by the year 600 or so, you have pretty much the canon as the first Eucharistic prayer as we have it today, and it remained the only Eucharistic prayer of the Roman Rite until the Vatican II reform. So other liturgical traditions have several Eucharistic prayers, but in Rome there was just this one. And wherever the Roman Rite was adopted, that was also adopted as the Eucharistic prayer. So you may have had variations in the structure of the Mass, in the introductory rites, in the offertory rites. There wasn't a uniformity, but certain elements identified sort of the Roman liturgical family, and one of them was the Eucharistic prayer, which remained the Roman canon.
And I mean, it's very rich, and I'm sure that I heard it as a kid, but I do feel like as an adult, I've started to hear it more. Maybe used in more Novus Ordo parishes. My parish, they definitely used it always on Sundays and solemnities. And then some of the priests use it for daily mass as they prefer. But of course, I'm a believer that the church cannot promulgate, harmful liturgical rites or anything like that. But some prayers in the liturgy can be relatively richer, perhaps, than others, right? And I do feel that the Roman canon is the richest of those Eucharistic prayers in the Roman Rite. So it does seem like a shame that people can attend Mass their whole life and rarely hear it, especially in past decades.
And it certainly wasn't intended by the Vatican II liturgical reform that the second Eucharistic prayer should always be used, that it should be should almost replace the first Eucharistic prayer.
Right. Yes, that is the most common one that I remember growing up. So you wrote another book about prayer facing east, particularly in the liturgy, and it's kind of odd that this should have largely disappeared in the West after Vatican II, given that this is, of course, an ancient thing, so it's from the sources, and not only that, but it's not only ancient, but it is also traditional in that it's been done constantly. Now, I've heard traditionalists claim that this in every part of the church, in every part of the world, for all of history prior to Vatican II, Mass was celebrated facing the east, except for maybe a few exceptions in certain Roman basilicas. Is that a more or less accurate claim?
Yes, generally yes. I mean, there were some exceptions. Now, when you go back into the early Christian period, you have some altar arrangements that would not allow the priest and the people to face the same way, and that was probably the practice in St. Peter's in the early centuries, but it's not quite clear what actually happened there. Certainly from the time of Gregory the Great, who basically set up the altar over the tomb of the apostles, in the same way as it is today, but in a different style. From that period onwards, the priest or the pope, usually at the altar, was facing towards the doors. Well, actually facing east, because St. Peter's has the entrance in the east. And what the people did is not so clear, but at some point you probably had a sort of kind of facing the people arrangement, although it wasn't felt to be as facing the people, really. That wasn't really the point.
Right.
This kind of theological weight that's given to this idea is a modern thing. And then you have later in the early medieval period, you have churches deliberately imitating St. Peter's, consciously imitating the papal practice and at the great papal basilica. And so you have some churches where you had this arrangement, but the more common practice was so facing east, or Eastern people facing the same direction. But again, here you have the question of the use of history, because again, in the middle of the 20th century, it was widely believed that the original practice, again, the early practice, was mass facing the people, and that facing east only came in later. And it took some important contributions to historical scholarship in the 20th century to convince people of the opposite. But again, I don't think the historical argument was the most important one. It was really the principle of active participation, and
right.
facing the people was meant to encourage active participation of the people.
So it wasn't really a matter of the priest facing the tabernacle per se. It was a matter. It was east, the principle of facing. And what's the theological significance of east?
Well, the east is identified with the direction of Christ's second coming.
Okay.
So we have this early tradition, and really early tradition, and very quite universal tradition in the early church, that Christ would come from the east as the sun would rise from the east. And that was interpreted as symbol of his resurrection, of his second coming. So it's a turning towards Christ in prayer. And that then determined the layout of churches. So unless you had some constraints, like in Rome, you had to fit into an existing street plan, for instance. But most early churches are oriented, and that's literally oriented. The great medieval cathedrals, you may have seen the extraordinary ceremony of the reopening of Notre Dame, which we had last Saturday. Of course, that's oriented, literally facing east. So where possible then, a church was oriented. Sadly, in the West, that tradition of really orienting churches in the literal sense got lost in the 15th, 16th century. And even where it was possible, it was no longer practiced. So that cosmic connection got a bit lost. The Eastern Orthodox churches, on the other hand, have retained it. It's still alive there. And
right.
So you have the facing towards Christ, and also, and then Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, wrote beautifully about this. You have really a kind of movement towards Christ, who is coming to be present in the liturgy, and the priest, of course, in a way, acts in the person of Christ, but also leads the body of Christ, the faithful, towards that encounter with Christ.
Yes, so I well remember my first time experiencing the Mass at Orientem, and I don't think I had ever been primed for that experience with any kind of propaganda one way or the other. I was used to Mass facing the people, but it actually was a Latin Novus Ordo at a Catholic college here in the United States, and it just immediately clicked, and I was like, this makes sense, this is right. I felt actually more united with the priest, like we're doing the same thing. And I suppose I wasn't really thinking about east per se, but just the fact that the priest and the people were facing the same direction, both facing the altar, both facing the tabernacle, was very powerful. And I still feel that way. And my other experience now, for context, I mostly attend the Novus Ordo. I have a parish where run by the Dominicans here in New York, and it's done very reverently. We also have a Saturday morning Dominican Rite, which is great. But the Novus Ordo, it's usually versus populum, except for on weekday solemnities. we have started doing it at the high altar at Orientem. But anyway, my point is that I don't mostly attend the old liturgy, but there was a period where I was trying to go to 1 or 2 daily masses and the traditional Latin mass every week. And one of the main things I got out of that experience was, I think, a greater sense of the sacrifice of the mass, of the Trinitarian nature of the sacrifice of the mass, that this is not just the Son of God being offered up for our sins, but also the Son of God being offered in the eternal act of worship to the Father. And I think that seeing the priest facing the altar, and he's always facing the altar, I suppose, but facing the tabernacle, just made that a lot more intuitive. It's not like I heard a homily on it. I started becoming aware of this in my meditation during Mass because of the direction the priest was facing.
I agree. I think the sacrificial character of the Mass is much clearer it's more clearly expressed in the liturgical sign when the priest faces the same direction of the people as the people. Historically, when you have an act of sacrifice, it's really the priest approaching, well, if we speak in very general terms, the deity, so sort of standing before, in a way, God to present the sacrifice. And I think something similar happens when the priest faces the same direction as the people. There is a greater sense in really offering the sacrifice of Christ to the eternal Father here. So a sacrificial action that not only makes Christ's presence, real presence in early communion, but Christ's presence in his sacrifice of the cross, and that sacrificial sort of expression is, I think, communicated better. I mean, it's of course there in the sacrifice,
yes,
there in the Mass facing the people as well, but it's just somehow more fitting as an expression of that sacrifice.
Yes, and again, my first experience of it was that I felt like I was participating more in the action of the priest, but. Isn't there something? Do you think there's something a bit scandalous about the abandonment of a tradition that was so universal, not just in the West, but in all parts of the Church? It seems like what I keep coming back to, and like I said, I mostly attend the Novus Ordo, and it's what I grew up with. But one of the biggest points of pain for me with the liturgical reform is the sense of and I have to be careful here, but the sense of the impiety of simply changing things because we think it's a good idea, things that have been done for so long. I can't necessarily give an argument for why, a dead-on, apodictic theological argument for why, women shouldn't be in the sanctuary or something like that. But it seems like if this has been done for 2,000 years across all of the rites of the Church, there's probably a good reason for it. And so where my soul takes offense is not so much often, not always the content of the individual change, but just the principle of we know better and we can change things, and sort of now feeling cut off from the past in a way.
I think there is a lack of sense of, tradition, obviously, the lack of sense that here we have something received from the past. We've received a great treasure which previous generations have handed on to us, and it's something we don't own. It's not something we can change at will and as we think best. I mean, there may be certain things that perhaps need pruning and adjusting, but if we go about that, it should be in a very reverential and humble attitude towards what we have received. And I think this is probably a wider problem, that lack of tradition in Western culture, from which the Church is also suffering, and the liturgy is suffering. That's what I admire about the Eastern Christian traditions, that their sense of liturgical tradition is very much alive. I mean, it's, I think,
Yes.
quite unthinkable that they would just go about and change their liturgy in this kind of technical way. And again, to return
Right.
to the analogy which Pope Benedict used, I mean, our attitude towards the liturgy should be that of a gardener, not that of a technician who just, replaces one machine with another one and throws the old one on the junkyard.
Yes, and this is another thing that I find very troubling. And this is something that I've been reading a little bit of The Heresy of Formlessness by Martin Mosebach. And one of the early essays in that book, he mentions one of some of the damage done by the liturgical reform is that we lose that ability to simply receive the liturgy in a non-critical way. And likewise with that technician's attitude towards it, or that expert's attitude towards it, I don't have much confidence that anytime in the near future we can even go back to that attitude that the East they still have in the East, because even if we change things to make them more like they used to be, we're still changing them. We're still making decisions about what's best, and we're not able to receive it in an organic way. So that is. Again, that contributes to my sense of feeling kind of alienated and cut off from the past and inescapably modern in a way. So I don't really know what can be done, because no matter how much of a traditionalist one is, traditionalism itself is a modern phenomenon,
Yes, Martin Mosebach said at one point, and I'm not sure whether that's in one of his writings or whether he said it to me, he's a good friend of mine, that he sadly finds himself often like a theater critic when he goes to Mass, that he finds himself in a position where he observes and then passes judgment on this, that, and the other, because that's sort of our attitude towards the liturgy as well today, because we have somehow lost that really living in the tradition by force. I mean, as you say, even those who are attached to traditional liturgical forms probably will also find themselves in that situation. How can we reconnect with that? Well, I think certainly by making the traditional liturgical forms available, by allowing them to be present in our day, but not insisting on their exclusivity, and trying somehow to reconnect these threads again. That will probably take a long time.
I think even if the experience, the sense of receiving things from the past is very compromised for the foreseeable future, I think we can still have the experience of receiving things from the church. Because I'm a big proponent of, obedience in these matters, regardless of the difficult situation we find ourselves in. And also, again, as I think some pope or other taught in, I think it's Auctorem Fidei, that the church cannot promote harmful rites that are harmful to the faith. And I think that's very important, that we can make relative comparisons. We can say this is richer, or this change shouldn't have been made. But what I find myself coming back to is not really attacking the Novus Ordo per se, but my sense of scandal at the attitude of the people making the changes, and the kind of the disruption that caused to the lives of people in the church after Vatican II. In a sense, there's a sense I'm encouraged by the fact that I don't think that could happen again in the foreseeable future, because people now are aware of what was lost, and I don't think there's going to be such a complete rupture, because I think people won't simply accept being cut off from the past the way that many Catholics did for a time after the council. But I do think we also have to we can start by, I mean, there's a lot of bad preaching in the church, but I come to it with a conviction that there's always going to be something, unless maybe it's outright heretical, there's always going to be something that God wants me to gain from this, even a mediocre homily. And so I think even more so with the liturgy, which is in itself a holy thing, even if it could be a better form, a higher form, a more solemn form. I think we can already try to recover that. I mean, you were talking about Martin Mosbach. What he says is quite right, but that's a tendency that we have to resist and try to be childlike in our experience of the liturgy.
And I think one also should not idealize a certain historical period. The 1950s were certainly not an ideal period for liturgical life. And already at the time, the need was felt to accommodate the liturgy to, I suppose, people's active participation. So in many parts of the world, what happened was that the liturgy would be celebrated correctly according to the book, say by the priest at the altar, and some sort of catechist would read out text in the vernacular while the low mass was celebrated. And in fact, there was a recent article in Antiphon on the practice of children's masses, which surprisingly started in the middle of the 19th century. And so you had quite a wide movement of children's masses in England, in the United States, where most of the liturgy was actually overled by hymns, popular prayers, catechesis, all in English, to bring children to the Mass with good intention, but thereby sort of creating a sort of paraliturgy that basically covered most of what was going on at the altar. So all of that wasn't ideal either. And in a way, perhaps, we only now realize better what the great treasure the Church's liturgical tradition is because of that loss that we experienced. So we're actually in a better position to appreciate what a great treasure it is.
Well, okay, here's a sentence from your book that struck me. You wrote, "The structure of the solemn Mass is not a linear sequence, but rather a complex fabric of different ritual actions that are performed simultaneously." What is the significance of that line?
Well, if you look at the solemn Mass in the traditional Roman Rite, there are several there are moments when several things are going on at the same time. So the celebrant may be saying some particular prayers. The deacon is involved in some ritual action. The subdeacon as well. At the same time, the scholar is singing. So it's quite a complex liturgical action, and it's not always sort of one thing after the other, sort of very discrete and logical, as it were. And you're not meant to sort of follow sort of one logical step after the other, but it's a more it's a more complex ritual that appeals to our senses by sort of visual sense, obviously the particular rites and ceremonies, the hearing, singing, but even the smell of incense and so on. And that was certainly very much the experience of the liturgy in sort of Central and later Middle Ages, where people were involved in a multisensory experience. Good, they didn't know Latin; they wouldn't have been able, say, to translate one of these prayers exactly into their own language. But they had quite a good sense of what was actually going on in the Mass, and they could tune into that.
And so is part of the implication that if you're at Mass in the late Middle Ages and you see a solemn Mass and the priest is doing something and the deacon is doing something and something else and the singers are doing something else, but it's all related, then there's a more intuitive sense that whatever the participation for the laity means, it doesn't necessarily have to mean doing the exact same thing that the priest is doing, because you already see that the other clerics involved are not doing all the exact same thing that the priest is doing.
Yes, and that popular participation was unscripted. It was not written down. It was not sort of regulated. Of course, people were expected to behave in a certain reverent way, but uh, it wasn't as described in the same detail with the same attention as, say, the rubrics for the clergy. So that makes it more difficult for us to understand how the people participated. We would like to know that, and our main sources would be written. So we don't have them, but we do get a sense from some descriptions that the people, in fact, were involved and were participating in the rite.
My experience, my impression has been that the Novus Ordo gives more freedom to the priest and less freedom to the people, and the Old Mass gives, and I like the term classical Roman Rite. That's probably my favorite that I've heard. Gives less freedom to the priest and more freedom to the congregation in terms of how they pray. And of course, that freedom can be a challenge if you're not used to it. I mean, it's like having a sheet music versus improvising. It's challenging, though. It can be challenging in the way that mental prayer is challenging if you don't find yourself with something to grasp onto. So, but it also has the potential for the congregation member to have each Mass be a far more unique experience in a way. Because it is a more meditative, a more free roaming contemplative experience, always related to what is happening at the altar. But there's still a kind of liberty to that experience as well that is not possible to the same extent, perhaps in essence, for someone who's deeply participating in the Novus Ordo. It's there, but the extent of that liberty and simply on a practical level, what your mind is able to be occupied with in the Latin Mass is very different than if you have to be listening to every word the priest says and responding in a certain way, etc.
Yes, I like that description. I think it's very well put, and possibly one reason why the classical Roman Rite is attractive to many young Catholics today who take their faith seriously, is the fact that you can actually participate in it in a much freer way. That it's not so regimented on the part of the of people. That you can sort of pray in a freer way, in a more meditative way. You can. If you want, of course, read all the prayers, follow all the prayers in your missal, but you can also adopt a more meditative form of prayer, and that is often not possible in New Rite celebrations, because there is very much a dominance of the word, the spoken word. Of course, when you have a a solemn mass with, say, Latin ordinary chant polyphony, then you also have that quality in the ordinary form. But often, if it is perhaps a set mass with a few hymns, then it doesn't give you the same freedom to participate. And since I guess the younger generations are more and more individualistic, this is actually something that appeals to them in the right.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's talk for a moment about the development of sacred or so-called hieratic language. I've heard varying claims about how much Latin, a layperson in the Roman Rite in, say, the 5th century, or maybe later in a time when people spoke Latin, would have been able to understand. I've heard claims that, well, this was almost a totally different form of Latin and they wouldn't have been able to understand it. It was the same language in name only. And I've heard, and I've also read a specific, primary source quotes that seemed of anecdotes that seemed to indicate that people were able to understand what was going on, that it was close enough to be able to understand the Latin. What's the reality here, and also what is the significance of the development of a separate kind of language, even if it's not a totally different tongue?
I'm not an expert in the linguistic history of Latin, but I would think that the people were able to understand quite a bit of the Latin prayers if they were able to hear them. I'll come back to that point later. So it is an elevated language. It is quite a polished language, beautiful prose, but it is essentially the Latin of the day, and people were used to going to great rhetorical displays. I mean, public speaking was very important for social and political life in Rome. Rhetoric was the great career path. I think they would have certainly understood the sense of a prayer. Of course, a lot of these prayers use quite specific theological vocabulary, so you also need a certain level of catechesis to follow.
Yes, but that's true even in the English consubstantial, right? Once it's been accurately translated.
Another question was what they actually heard in a big Roman basilica. And old St. Peter's was not quite as big as the nascent St. Peter's, but very big. And St. Paul's is very large, the Lateran. If you stood at the back of the church and say the Pope or Bishop or priest was officiating at the altar, even if they protected their voice, as they would have been trained to do, you didn't hear everything. And that's one question historians have asked about the preaching of some of the popes. If St. Leo the Great preached sitting on his throne in the apse of the Roman Basilica, I mean, who would have heard that? The clergy around him, yes, but people further back, probably not. So again, quite a different attitude to our modern attitude, where you're meant to hear about just about every word being spoken at a mass. So I think that was, but I think the language was still quite close to Latin that was spoken. Elevated, yes, but still the same language.
Some people will justify the extent of the changes after Vatican II by reference to the Council of Trent and adjustments that were made in the so-called Tridentine Mass. Some people don't like that term because it implies that it simply originated with the Council of Trent, which is of course not true. But is the Reform of Trent really at all comparable in significance or extent to the changes to the Mass after Vatican II?
No, I don't think so. It was a pruning. It was sort of a careful adjustment of certain aspects, a liturgical calendar. Rules were introduced when you could use a saint's feast, a saint's formulary or votive mass. Sundays were given priorities. Octaves were simplified. That really was the kind of reform you had at Trent, but you did not have such a far-reaching reworking of all liturgical books as happened after Vatican II. I don't think these two liturgical reforms really are on the same level.
The other aspect to consider here is that of centralization and standardization, which there was some of both in the the Carolingian reforms a few hundred years earlier and at Trent, and I think there was, for the past 1,000 years, very much of an impulse towards Roman centralization and standardization of the liturgy, and the suppression of different forms, at least, that weren't sufficiently old. So was it that in Trent, I think it was that if a form was older than 200 years, something like that, then they could keep it. But other than that, new liturgies had to be suppressed, replaced with the Roman Rite as defined by the Council of Trent. But now I see some people regretting that impulse. Sometimes even in the traditionalist circles, some of them will want everything to be imposed, their thing to be imposed from on high, and others will say, just let 1,000 flowers bloom. This, maybe this was appropriate 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, but now let's just have peace, And so what do you think about that, that re-evaluating of past reforms, perhaps in light of modern problems, and saying, well, maybe it wasn't necessary for for Trent to suppress all these things, or maybe it wasn't necessary for the Gregorian and the reforms under Charlemagne to try to universally mandate a certain form of the Roman Rite and things like that.
Well, one has to understand these particular reforms in their own historical context. I mean, there were reasons for these reforms and for the ways in which they were implemented. I mean, after Trent, some dioceses gave up their particular rites, even though they were more than older than 200 years. But it was felt really necessary to show the unity of the Catholic Church in the face of the Protestant challenge, and to show that unity also in the liturgical forms, in the liturgical expressions. So that that is one reason why you had such a drive towards uniformity. And yes, I would have sympathy for the argument that too great a uniformity is not desirable and hasn't done the church good in that regard.
And this was at times done for political reasons, right, as well, like under Charlemagne.
That too. Well, yes, but not just political. I mean, Charlemagne saw himself as a sacred ruler who duty it was to lead his people in Christian worship, really.
I see.
And again, these historical reforms, they didn't have the same reach and efficiency as modern liturgical reforms. I mean, you have to distinguish between the kind of rhetoric a ruler, even a pope, would employ, and what they could actually do, which is not nearly as much as, well, a pope of the 16th century and certainly not a pope of the 20th century. So I mean, there are Western non-Roman traditions, the Ambrosian Rite, the Mozarabic Rite, which are genuine enrichment. I took part in the Mozarabic celebration of Corpus Christi a few years ago. And so the Mozarabic Rite has survived, has been revived even. It's now also celebrated in Spanish. And it was just wonderful. It was just fantastic to have a genuine, so authentic, non-Roman Western liturgical tradition flourishing.
Right.
So, yes, I mean, it's you cannot sort of turn back or the wheel of history. So these developments happened, and it also I mean, we mentioned earlier the difficulty of the idea of connecting to some early church tradition and simply just trying to revive that without the centuries intervening. Also, I think in an analogous way, you can't now say revive the Sarum use in England.
Right.
Recreate that in the 21st century, as fascinating as it would be. I mean, it was in many ways richer, a more florid and expression of the Roman Rite, lots of processional elements and beautiful sacred music and everything. But there's no continuity, there's no tradition there. I mean, it was interrupted by the Protestant Reformation, and you can't simply sort of reconnect over sort of the distance of 500 years.
One more question. Currently, it's sort of defined from on high that what's called the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo are both the Roman Rite. And of course, Pope Francis says the Novus Ordo is the unique expression of the Roman Rite, but setting that aside, the official language is these are both the Roman Rite. Yeah, that seems to me to be a matter of historical judgment rather than a faith of morals that people can disagree with what that means. And it also seems to me that probably anybody who attends both or has attended both, including the people wanting to suppress the Latin Mass, are well aware of how profoundly different the experience of these two liturgies can be, and generally is. And even their ethos, in a certain sense, have to be careful not to go too far with that. But could this be a kind of a legal fiction? Or even if it's true that they're both the same rite, how meaningful is it to really speak about them as the same rite of the Mass?
Well, I think this question can not be answered simply by recourse to our experience of liturgical celebration. So our experience how one form or one use of the rite is celebrated or the other. Pope Benedict wrote somewhere that even in the period after Trent, surely the experience of the Mass was quite different, whether you had a sort of solemn pontifical celebration in a French cathedral, Mass in a Bavarian village, or say in a missionary outpost in the Andes. So I'm sure the actual experience could have been quite different. So there must be more than just that if you really want to talk about rites and whether these two sort of expressions belong to the same rite. Now you could, of course, just adopt a kind of positivistic view, saying this is the rite adopted by the Roman Church, so it is the Roman rite.
Right.
These are the books the Roman Church has promulgated, so that is the Roman rite. Many might not consider such an answer satisfactory. When you look then at the ritual structure, well, certainly the Mass has the same essential structure. Introductory rites, liturgy of the word.
But isn't that true with Eastern rites as well?
Yes, I suppose it is, but I suppose, but there you have certain particular elements like sort of the litanies, which distinguish these Eastern rites as either the great entrance of the gifts. So, I would say it is the same. It is the same rite, because it still has enough sort of identifiable elements of structure, Kyrie, Gloria, Credo when prescribed, Sanctus, Agnus Dei, liturgical, Eucharistic prayer. Of course, there's a certain variability which you do not have in the historical Roman rite. I think there are enough pointers there that still make it the same rite in different expressions.
I see. Any final thoughts on how some of these issues may be resolved? I mean, let's say even perhaps for the layperson doesn't have authority over liturgical reform really. So what can we do to help these things along, but also to remain in a spirit of charity and holiness as we do so?
Well, I think patience certainly is required, because these things will not be sorted out in the near future. Charity is certainly important. I think the whole liturgical question is not served by the harshness and the polemical tone that you often find in these debates. I think one has to approach these issues with a greater calmness. Also, I think it's important not to assume that the person you disagree with has sort of bad motives. We might, and I do certainly regret some of the reformers' decisions, but one must be careful to try and understand their motives. They did even with some controversial decisions, then you genuinely think it was for the good of the church. Otherwise, so we sort of work patiently and do what we can where we are for fostering the liturgical life. And I think the lay people also have a lot of impact. I think you can do that by supporting sort of sound liturgical initiatives, sort of showing support to priests who really want to work to reconnect these threads of ritual that have been torn. then, well, I think there can indeed be that sort of revival of liturgical life which we're desiring.
All right, Father Michael, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for having me. It's very enjoyable.
So again, the book is A Short History of the Roman Mass from Ignatius Press. I will link to that for you to be able to purchase in the show notes for today's episode. Everybody, thanks for listening. I believe this will be my last episode before Christmas, so have a blessed rest of Advent, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and I will probably see you next in the new year.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.